Hello, this is Sondra Oster Baras bringing you a few words of Bible from the heart of Biblical Israel. This week's Torah portion is Nitzavim, and it begins in Deuteronomy 29, verse 9, and it begins, Nitzavim itself means stand. You stand here this day, all of you, before the Lord your God, your tribal heads, your elders, and your officials, all the men of Israel, your children, your wives, even the stranger within your camp, from wood chopper to water drawer, to enter into the covenant of the Lord your God. This is how the Torah portion begins, and actually it's in the middle of a number of chapters that deal with this idea of a covenant between the God of Israel, and the nation of Israel, a covenant that to some extent will be entered into right there and then before they enter the land of Israel, the plains of Moab, which is what we see in the last verse of chapter 28. And in addition, will be entered into after they enter the land of Israel as they stand between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. What I'd like to focus on today, though, are just two verses that I find very significant as Moses introduces this idea or discusses this idea of the covenant. What is the covenant all about? And he says here in verse 13, I make its covenant with its actions, not with you alone, but both with those who are standing here with us on this day before the Lord your God, and with those who are not with us here this day. Now, this is actually a very unusual kind of thing, because if you think of a covenant like a contract, then a contract is between two parties or two people. If you're going to bind somebody to a covenant or to a contract, they have to be present. They have to have signed on to it. They have to agree to the terms. And yet here, Moses makes it very clear that this covenant is not only with them, the generation of Israel that is currently standing before Moses and about to enter into the land of Israel, but it is also with all the generations that will follow. And I think this is something that is very, very important. It is critical to an understanding of Judaism, to an understanding of the sense that we have within the nation of Israel, how we are bound to God. We know of the original covenants, the covenants with the forefathers, covenants that really are more like promises. But once we get to the nation of Israel, we have a covenant at Sinai, and then we have another covenant here. In both cases, there is a sense that that covenant goes way beyond anything that particular generation would have agreed to. In this case, it is spelled out for us that God is entering into a covenant with those of that generation, but that they represent the generations ever after of the nation of Israel. And in fact, very often, Jews today, even Jews who are loyal to the Torah, who follow the commandments, will talk about themselves as people of the covenant. It's this covenant. It's this covenant and the covenant of Sinai. The people today will say, yes, this covenant, we were parties to that covenant. Now, it's very interesting that with regard to the covenant at Sinai, a revelation at Sinai, there is a very well-known midrash that states this in a very beautiful way. Typically, the midrash will very often talk about things in a certain supernatural kind of way, and the importance of this is not the supernatural part of it, but the message of it. What is the point? And with regard to the standing of the nation of Israel before Sinai and receiving the Ten Commandments, which is the first covenant, of course, and there the Midrash says that all the souls of Israel, all those who would be born ever from that point on, all the souls were present at Sinai. And really, that is a very beautiful way of expressing what is said here. It's not only with those who are standing there, but with those who will come after. And the Midrash says it about Sinai in a very beautiful way, as if there's this presence of everyone's soul. I may have been born in 1957, but my soul was there 4,000 years ago, or 3,500 years ago, at Sinai. So that already when I was born into the covenant. And I have accepted the covenant even before I have any knowledge or understanding to be able to personally accept it. I was already born into it. And that is what these verses are talking about. That the people of Israel, the generations after, are born into the covenant. Now, of course, there are those who reject the covenant, who leave the covenant, who rebel against the covenant. But that is the action that is necessary. The automatic assumption is that you're born into the covenant. If you reject the covenant, that is the action that will make a difference, which is actually very interesting, because very often in different faiths, you have to actively accept the faith in order to be part of the faith. Whereas in Judaism, you are assumed to be part of the covenant, and it is the act of rejection that will take you out of the covenant if you want. And actually, if you actively reject the covenant, but then come back into the covenant, you are welcome, and you can come back. And this idea is actually carried through later on in the chapter in verse 21, where it says, in a later generation, the children who succeed you and foreigners who come from distant lands, they will ask. And so this is already saying, this is referring to a punishment. There'll be a time of punishment when those who have left the covenant, who have abandoned the covenant, who have followed pagan gods, and then God will bring punishment. And these people will ask, what's going on? What is happening here? And then the answer will be, because they left the covenant. So there's already a consciousness here. And the later generation will ask, your sons will ask. So it's not just that the sons have come into the covenant, but that there will be later generations that will need to understand what that covenant is and will ask about it. And then they will understand that they were bound to this covenant, and the covenant was abandoned, and now they have the opportunity to return to the covenant. And of course, it's afterwards in chapter 30 that we have this theme of return. So, this is the theme here that I wanted to stress that is so important in this week's Torah portion. This is the covenant that binds God to the nation of Israel forever, from the moment of Sinai through this moment as they're about to enter the land of Israel, and forever, until the end of time. God has bound himself to the nation of Israel by covenant. This has been a few words of Bible from the heart of Biblical Israel. Have a wonderful weekend. Shabbat Shalom.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.